The night Elias Cooper walked into the Sweetwater Springs Harvest Social, he did so the way a man walks into a room where he knows he does not belong, shoulders drawn inward, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the middle distance between himself and everything else, as though he had perfected the art of being present and invisible at the same time. It was the autumn of 1879, and Sweetwater Springs, Texas sat at the edge of the Edwards Plateau like a town that had not yet decided whether it wanted to survive. The population hovered somewhere around 400 souls, depending on who you counted and who had recently drifted in or out on the back of a cattle drive. The Grange Hall at the center of town was the largest building most of those 400 had ever stood inside, and on Harvest Social nights, it was filled with lantern light and fiddle music, and the smell of apple cider and pine resin and women who had spent considerable time on their hair. Elias Cooper had spent no time on his hair. He was 31 years old, broad in the shoulders but lean everywhere else, with the kind of hands that told the entire story of a man's life without him having to speak a word. His knuckles were scarred. His palms were calloused. There was a faint white line along his left jaw where something had once caught him at an angle, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray that people sometimes called blue when the light was kind. He wore his good shirt, which was clean but frayed at both cuffs, and his boots had been polished until the leather gleamed despite the cracks running through it. He had made an effort. Nobody in that room was going to notice the effort, but he had made it. He was a rancher, if you could call a man with 47 acres and a herd of 11 cattle a rancher. His spread sat 3 miles south of town on land that had been cheap because the well was unreliable and the previous owner had left in something of a hurry. Elias had spent 2 years repairing what the previous owner had broken and building what had never existed, and he was slowly, stubbornly, turning the place into something real. But slowly and stubbornly were not qualities that made a man popular at harvest socials. They were qualities that made a man tired and quiet and prone to standing near the wall with a cup of cider that he forgot to drink. He found his wall. It was the east wall, beside a window that was cracked open just enough to let in the cool October air, and he stationed himself there with the particular stillness of a man who has decided that arriving was enough of an achievement for one evening. Around him, Sweetwater Springs celebrated. The Beaumont brothers had driven their cattle to market and come back flush with money and loud with celebration. Mayor Aldrich was making his rounds with the practiced warmth of a man who needed every vote he could gather before December. Widow Thatcher was showing off the quilt she intended to auction, and a circle of women near the refreshment table was engaged in the kind of conversation that involved frequent glances across the room and lowered voices. Children ran between the legs of adults in the particular way that children do when they understand that the normal rules of evening behavior have been suspended. The fiddle player launched into a reel, and the center of the hall became a blur of skirts and boot heels, and Elias watched all of it with the expression of a man who has made peace with watching rather than participating. He did not notice Rose Norris when she walked in, which was unusual, because Rose Norris was the kind of woman most men in Sweetwater Springs made a point of noticing. She was 24 years old, the daughter of the late Harold Norris who had owned the feed store until his heart gave out 2 springs prior, and she had been running that feed store herself ever since, with a competence that impressed the ranchers who did business there, and unsettled the men who felt that competence in a woman was somehow a personal affront to them. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way the magazines that arrived 3 weeks late from back east suggested women should be beautiful, but she had dark hair and dark eyes, and a particular quality of attention that made whoever she was talking to feel that they were the most interesting person in whatever room she was standing in. She wore a green dress tonight, the color of sage after rain, and her hair was pinned up with a tortoiseshell comb that had belonged to her mother. She came in with her friend Martha Delaney, and Martha immediately went to find her beau, and Rose was left standing at the edge of the social hall taking in the room with those dark, attentive eyes. She saw Elias Cooper within the first 3 minutes. She had seen him before, of course. He came into the feed store once a month for grain and occasionally for fence wire, and he always paid on time and never haggled and said please and thank you with a sincerity that most men in her store forgot was an option. She knew his name. She knew his land was south of town. She knew he worked it alone. She did not know him, not really, but she had noticed him in the way that a woman with dark, attentive eyes notices quiet things. The way you notice a single tree on an open plain, standing there in all that space, doing the work of existing without any fuss about it. She watched him now. He was standing by the east wall with a cup he wasn't drinking and the posture of a man doing his level best to be part of the furniture, and something about that image, about the clean frayed cuffs and the polished cracked boots and the careful invisibility of him, settled in her chest in a way she couldn't quite account for. "Have you spoken to him?" Martha was suddenly at her elbow, having apparently located and lost her bow in the space of 5 minutes. "Who?" Rose said, which was a performance because she had not taken her eyes off the east wall. "Elias Cooper, the man you have been staring at since you walked in the door." "I have not been staring," Rose said. "I have been observing." Martha, who had known Rose since they were both 7 years old, gave her the look that 20 years of friendship entitles a person to give. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," Rose said. "One is rude, the other is interested." Martha followed her gaze across the room. "He doesn't look like he wants to be talked to." "He doesn't look like he wants to be invisible either," Rose said. "Those are two different things." The evening wore on. The fiddle shifted from reels to waltzes. Couples paired off on the floor, and the people who had no partners migrated toward the walls, and somehow the social geography of the hall sorted itself into the participated and the watching, and Elias Cooper remained on his side of that invisible line with a consistency that started to look less like preference and more like habit so old he had forgotten he'd made it. Rose watched the way people moved around him. Not rudely. There was nothing cruel in it. It was simply that nobody moved toward him. He occupied a kind of social dead zone, and everyone was very comfortable pretending that zone did not exist. The Beaumont brothers were holding court near the cider barrel. Mayor Aldrich had settled in with the merchants. The younger ranchers clustered together talking cattle prices and weather and the new barbed wire that was changing everything about how land worked in Texas. Elias was not part of any of those groups, and it occurred to Rose, watching all of this, that his isolation was not something anyone had inflicted on him. It was something he had constructed very carefully around himself, and everyone had simply agreed to respect it. She thought about that for a while. She thought about her own store, and about the way he came in and did his business and left, and about how she had always wanted to ask him how the well was coming, and whether the southeast pasture was recovering from the drought, and what he thought about the new railroad route that everyone in town was arguing about. She had not asked any of those things, because he had the look of a man who had his conversations mapped out in advance and did not have room in that map for detours. But she was watching him, and she had been watching him, and at a certain point in the evening, it was past 9 o'clock, and the fiddle had slowed to something almost melancholy. She decided that there was nothing in the world stopping her from walking across that room. She set down her cider cup. She straightened her spine, not because she needed to, but because it was the kind of gesture that committed you to what you were about to do. And she walked across the Sweetwater Springs Grange Hall, past the Beaumont brothers and past Mayor Aldrich, and past the women near the refreshment table who watched her progress with the particular attention of people who sense that something interesting is happening. And she arrived at the east wall beside the window that was cracked open to the cool October air, and she stopped in front of Elias Cooper. He looked up. His gray eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance, focused on her with an expression that moved through surprise and something that might have been alarm before it settled into careful stillness. "Mr. Cooper," she said. "Miss Norris," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words the way a prospector chose ground, not from abundance, but because he couldn't afford waste. "I have been watching you all evening," she said. The careful stillness on his face shifted. He blinked once. "Have you?" he said, and it came out less as a question and more as a man carefully checking that he had heard correctly. "I have," she said, "and I thought that was information you should have. It seemed only fair." He looked at her for a long moment. The fiddle played something slow and sad, and the lantern light moved in a draft from the window, and somewhere a child laughed at something, and the whole living room of Sweetwater Springs went on around them as though the east wall didn't exist. "Why?" he asked. "Just that. One careful word." "Because you looked like the most interesting person in this room," she said, "and because nobody was talking to you. And because I own a feed store and you are one of my customers, and we have been exchanging grain receipts for 2 years without ever having a single real conversation, and I find that wasteful." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, it was the suggestion of a smile, the ghost of one, the way a fire looks right before it catches. "You find it wasteful," he repeated. "I do," she said. "I am 24 years old, Mr. Cooper. I don't have time to waste on conversations that aren't real." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He turned to face her fully, which meant he was no longer presenting himself to the room as a man who was merely tolerating being present, but as a man who was actually here, actually standing in this room, actually looking at this woman who had just walked across an entire hall to tell him she had been watching him. "What would a real conversation look like, Miss Norris?" he asked. She considered this seriously because he had asked it seriously. "It would start with something true," she said. "Not about the weather or the price of grain, something actually true." He looked down at the cup in his hand, the cider he still hadn't drunk, and then back at her. "I almost didn't come tonight," he said. "I drove 2 miles toward town and then turned around and went home. And then I felt like a fool for being afraid of a harvest social. And so I turned around again and came anyway. And since I walked in that door, I have been standing here trying to figure out why I thought that was a better choice than staying home." It was the most words she had ever heard him say at once. She felt something warm and complicated move through her. "And," she said, "the ghost of a smile became something more substantial, and I'm starting to think it might have been." They talked for an hour and a half. They talked while the fiddle played, and while the Beaumont brothers grew progressively louder, and while Mayor Aldrich gave a short speech about the town's prospects that everyone applauded politely. They talked about his land, the unreliable well, which he had finally coaxed into reliability through what sounded like a combination of engineering and stubbornness. They talked about her store, which she was slowly but steadily expanding beyond just feed into hardware and dry goods, because the town needed it, and she was the person who happened to be there to provide it. They talked about the railroad and about the way barbed wire was reshaping the open range, and about a book he had read over the winter, a battered copy of David Copperfield that a previous cattle driver had left behind at his place, and about the fact that she had read the same book and had opinions about it. He had opinions too. Quiet, careful opinions that he delivered as though he was not entirely certain he had the right to deliver them. And she found that quality, that carefulness, more compelling than all the confident pronouncements she had been subjected to by men who hadn't thought half as deeply and were twice as loud about it. When Martha found her near 10 o'clock, and gave her a meaningful look that contained entire volumes of unspoken commentary, Rose was startled to realize how much time had passed. "I should see my friend home," she said. "Of course," Elias said. He straightened slightly, as though remembering that posture was a thing he was supposed to have. "Miss Norris." "Thank you for—" He stopped, started again. "This was the best part of my evening." "Mine too," she said, and she meant it without qualification. She walked back across the room with Martha's hand tucked in her arm and Martha's voice already starting up in her ear with questions, and she did not look back, because she knew that if she looked back she would find him watching her, and she wasn't ready yet for what that might do to her heart. She was right that he was watching. She did not know how to be not right about that. The next morning, Rose Norris opened the Norris feed and supply at 7 o'clock the way she did every morning, swept the porch, turned the sign, and began tallying the previous week's accounts with the methodical focus that had kept the store solvent through 2 years of her sole management. The books balanced. They usually balanced. She was good at this. She was not as good at keeping her mind on the books, because her mind kept drifting east and a little south, to a piece of land with an unreliable well that had been made reliable and 11 cattle, and a man who had driven 2 miles toward a harvest social and turned back and then turned back again. She told herself she was being practical about it. He was a customer. He was a neighbor, loosely speaking. It was natural to think about a conversation she had enjoyed. There was nothing impractical about that. She was still telling herself she was being practical about it when the store door opened at 10:30 and Elias Cooper walked in, and she felt something in her chest do something she had no practical accounting for. He was carrying his hat, which he usually kept on. His hair was dark and a little unruly without it. He looked, if she was being precise about it, like a man who had made a decision on his way here and was hoping he hadn't made it wrong. "Mr. Cooper," she said. "It's not the first of the month." "No," he said. He set his hat on the counter between them with the deliberate care of a man who needs something to do with his hands. "I know that. Is something wrong with the last batch of grain?" "No, nothing's wrong." He looked at her steadily. "I was hoping you might have time for a cup of coffee." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light came through the store windows and lay in long gold stripes across the floorboards. "I'm working," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't leave. He was waiting, she realized, not because he thought she owed him an answer, but because he had come to ask a real question, and he intended to wait for a real answer. "I can take a half hour," she said. "There's a coffee pot in the back." She watched him understand that she was inviting him to step around the counter into the back room that was her domain, and she watched him take that invitation seriously, the way he seemed to take everything. The back room of the Norris Feed and Supply was not a romantic location by any measure. It smelled of grain and hemp rope and the slight metallic tang of the accounting ledgers. There was a small iron stove and 2 chairs, and a table that she used for checking inventory, and she put the coffee pot on the stove, and they sat across the table from each other in the plain morning light with no lanterns and no fiddle music and no social context to make the conversation feel like anything other than exactly what it was. They talked for a full hour, and she was 15 minutes late opening the front counter, which was a thing she had never once been in 2 years of operation. He came back the following Thursday, not on a first of the month, not to buy grain. He came with a question about fence wire that was almost certainly a reason rather than a reason, and she sold him the fence wire, and then they sat in the back room with coffee and talked until noon when she had a delivery to manage. The following week he came again, and the week after that. Sweetwater Springs noticed. Sweetwater Springs was a town of 400 souls, and it noticed everything. And it noticed with particular enthusiasm anything that involved Rose Norris, who was well-liked and respected, and the subject of considerable interest from several of the town's unattached men, none of whom she had shown any interest in. The fact that she was showing interest in Elias Cooper, quiet, solitary, fence-mending Elias Cooper, who ran 11 cattle on 47 unreliable acres, was the kind of thing that generated opinion. Most of the opinion was friendly, or at least neutral. Martha Delaney told anyone who would listen that she had seen it coming since the night of the harvest social. Mayor Aldrich, who had done business with Elias Cooper and found him honest and thorough, told his wife he thought it was fine news. The Beaumont brothers, who thought most things about other people's lives were their business, made a comment in the barbershop that reached Rose's ears 3 days later in a form she could not verify but found irritating. The comment, filtered through 3 separate tellings, was something to the effect that Elias Cooper was a man with nothing to offer a woman who deserved everything, and that Rose Norris could do considerably better. Rose Norris, who had heard this kind of comment before and would likely hear it again, set down the account she was reading and picked it back up, and did not dignify the comment with a response, because responding would require acknowledging that the comment had reached her, and she preferred for the Beaumont brothers to believe she operated in a different atmosphere entirely. But she thought about it in the way you think about something you have dismissed. She turned it over and examined it and eventually arrived at the same conclusion she always arrived at when she thought about Elias Cooper, that what he had was exactly what he said he had, and that honesty about your circumstances was worth more than she could put a price on. She told him about the comment. Not right away. It was another week before she mentioned it, on a Thursday morning over coffee, and she mentioned it not because she wanted him to do anything about it, but because she had decided early in their acquaintance that honesty between them was worth more than comfort. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the back window of the store, the town was going about its morning business, and there was the sound of a wagon and someone calling a name and the particular creak of the store sign in an October wind. "They're not wrong," he said. "They are wrong," she said, "about the important part." He looked at her, those gray eyes that she was learning to read like weather, the difference between cloud cover and actual rain. "What's the important part?" "The part where they decide what I deserve without asking me," she said. "I've been running this store for 2 years on my own, and I've been making my own decisions for longer than that, and I find it remarkable that men who can't balance their own accounts think they know what I need better than I do." Something in his expression shifted toward that quiet warmth she had started to recognize. "You have strong feelings about that," he said. "I have correct feelings about that," she said. He smiled then, a real one, not the ghost of one, and it transformed his face the way sunlight transforms a landscape you thought you knew, and she stored the image of it somewhere she did not have a name for yet. "I do want to build something real," he said. It came out careful but direct, which was the only way he ever said anything important. "I want you to know that. Whatever I have right now isn't much, but I'm not standing still with it. I intend to build something real." "I know that," she said. "You know it because I told you," he said, "or you know it because you believe it." "Both," she said, "but mostly because I've been watching you since before the Harvest Social, Elias Cooper. I know how you pay your bills. I know what you've done with that land in 2 years. I know what kind of man you are from what you do when you think nobody's paying attention." He was very still for a moment. Then, "How long have you been watching?" "Since you first walked into this store," she said simply. The October wind pushed the store sign and something in the moment rearranged itself. He reached across the table slowly, the way he did everything, with that deliberate care that she found more intimate than any hurry, and he covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and calloused and certain. Neither of them said anything for a while, because nothing needed saying right that moment. They began, in the way of the time and place, to court in the manner that was understood to be courtship in Sweetwater Springs, Texas, in the autumn of 1879. He came to the store on Thursdays. She invited him to Sunday supper twice in October, and he came both times and helped her with the dishes afterward, which made her neighbor Mrs. Blount, who had a view of the kitchen window, compose an entire theory about the situation that she shared with 6 separate people. He took her riding on the first Sunday in November when the weather was crisp, and the plains rolled out south of town in shades of amber and rust and pale gold. He showed her his land, all 47 acres of it, and the well that had been unreliable and now ran clear and steady, and the barn he had rebuilt from a frame that had been leaning toward collapse when he arrived, and the small stone house that was plain and clean and full of the evidence of a man who lived carefully. A shelf of books, a well-maintained stove, a workbench along one wall with tools laid out in a careful order that told you something about how he thought. She walked through the house with the serious attention she gave to things that mattered, and he watched her look at it and didn't say anything, which was the right instinct. She didn't need to be sold to. She was making up her own mind. You built this shelf yourself, she said, touching the wood of the bookshelf with her fingertips. I did, he said. It's well made, she said. It was genuinely well made, level and solid, the joints cut clean. Thank you, he said, and she could hear in those two words that it meant something to him, the way small acknowledgments mean something to people who are not in the habit of receiving them. Outside the stone house, his 11 cattle grazed in the low afternoon light, and the land lay quiet and wide all the way to the horizon, and she thought about what it would mean to belong to a place. She had been belonging to her store, which was a building in the middle of a town, and there was something about this open ground, something about the scale of it, that made her understand things about this man that 2 months of Thursday coffee hadn't quite translated. He was as big as his land. He needed room around him to be what he actually was. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He was standing beside her, close enough that she was aware of his warmth in the cool November air. "That it's a good place," she said. "It is," he said. "It'll be better." A pause, then quietly, "I'd like you to see it when it's better." She turned to look at him. The November light was low and long, and it caught the gray in his eyes and turned them something close to silver. "I'd like that too," she said. He took her hand. Just that, he took her hand and held it while they stood in the quiet of his land, and it was an extraordinarily ordinary thing, and she felt it everywhere. November deepened. They were in each other's company as often as the work of their respective lives allowed, which was not as often as either of them would have chosen, but was enough to establish a rhythm. She began to learn the grammar of him, the way a slightly more direct meeting of eyes meant he was about to say something important, the particular quality of his silences that distinguished thinking from discomfort from contentment. He learned her in return. She knew he was learning her because he began to ask the specific questions of a man who has been paying close attention to what you have left unsaid. "Your father left you the store outright," he said one Thursday morning. "No debts against it." "One debt," she said, "to the bank. I paid it off in the first year." He looked at her steadily. "A lot of people didn't think you'd manage it," he said, not a question. "A lot of people were wrong," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know. I wasn't one of them." He paused. "I came into this store 2 weeks after you took it over. You were reordering the inventory system. I watched you work for 20 minutes while you checked me out, and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "I thought you were the most competent person I'd seen since I came to this town," he said. "And then I thought about that on the drive home and realized I'd said it wrong in my head. I meant the most remarkable." She looked at him across the table in the back room of her store, in the plain morning light, over coffee that was getting cold, and something that had been slowly becoming undeniable became undeniable. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said very quietly, as if he already knew what she was going to say and was answering the whole sentence, not just his name. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said. The stillness that came over him was not the blank stillness of the east wall at the harvest social. It was the stillness of something that has been waiting so long it barely knows how to receive what it was waiting for. He reached across the table again and took both her hands this time, turning them up in his calloused palms as if checking that they were real, and then he looked up at her, and what was in his face was so plain and unguarded that it cost him something to let her see it, and she understood that this was the most valuable thing he had ever given anyone. "Rose," he said, "I have been in love with you since September." She laughed, a real laugh startled out of her. "September. We didn't even really talk in September." "I know," he said. "I said it was inconvenient." The ghost of a smile was all the way a smile now. "You walked into your own store one morning in September with a crate on your shoulder that was too heavy for it, and you told old Jim Patterson that if he wanted his grain in alphabetical order he was welcome to come back here and arrange it himself, and I was standing at the counter and He stopped. The smile went quiet and steady. "I thought, there is a woman who knows exactly who she is." "And that did it," she said softly. "That did it," he confirmed. Outside, Sweetwater Springs went about its morning, and inside, in the back room of a feed store that smelled of grain and hemp rope and accounting ledgers, something that had been growing since October, since before October, since September, since a September morning with a crate and a piece of honest backbone arrived at a place of clarity. She squeezed his hands. He squeezed back. They were going to have to talk about practical matters soon, the nature of his land and her store, and what a life made of both of those things would look like. But that was a conversation for another Thursday. This Thursday had already given them enough. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday afternoon in December, on the porch of her store after she had closed for the day, and the main street of Sweetwater Springs was quiet in the blue early winter dusk. He had clearly thought about how to do it for some time, because he had a speech prepared, a real one, the kind that took stock of facts and feelings in the careful way he did everything. And he delivered it with his hat in his hands and the cold December air turning his breath to smoke. And partway through the speech, she took his hat from him and set it on the railing because he needed his hands for something other than working the brim to death. He said, "I know my land is small and my herd is small, and I am not a man of great resources. I know I am asking you to take something on faith that most people would want to see proven first. I know that. But I also know that I will work every day of my life to make this land and this life worth everything you would be bringing to it, and that I will never give you reason to doubt that I see you clearly, not just what you can do, but who you are. And who you are is," he stopped. His voice had gone rough at the edges. "Who you are is the best thing I know," he said, "and I would like very much to spend the rest of my life telling you that." She had been keeping her face composed through most of this because she was a practical woman and she was not in the habit of dissolving in public. But the last sentence did something to her composure that she couldn't account for. "Yes," she said. She said it before he could get to the actual question, which made him blink. "I haven't asked yet," he said. "You have been asking since September," she said, and her voice was unsteady, "and the answer has been yes for about as long. Will you please just ask me so we can get out of the cold?" Something shone in his face, something purely bright and unguarded that she was going to see many times in her life and never get tired of. He took the ring from his pocket, a simple gold band that had been his mother's, and he took her hand and put it on her finger with the ceremony it deserved. "Rose Norris," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Elias Cooper, yes." He kissed her then, standing on the porch of the Norris feed and supply in the December dusk while the first stars appeared over the Edwards Plateau, and it was a careful kiss and a certain one, and it tasted like a promise being kept rather than one being made. They were married in January, on a Saturday when the sky was the hard, clear blue of winter, and the plains around Sweetwater Springs had a thin white coat of frost that made everything look like the beginning of something. The ceremony was in the little Methodist church on the north end of town, and it was not elaborate because neither of them wanted elaborate, but it was full. The whole town came, or near enough to it, because Rose was beloved and because Elias had, over the preceding months, crept quietly into the good opinion of the town in the way that quiet people do when you stop trying to make them fit a pattern that isn't theirs. Martha Delaney stood as Rose's witness, and wept through most of the ceremony with the happy conviction of a woman who has been right about something for months. Mayor Aldrich gave a toast at the small reception afterward that was genuinely warm and only slightly about the town's prospects. The Beaumont brothers attended and did not make any comments, largely because one of them had recently needed to borrow money and Elias had lent it without being asked. Elias Cooper in a good suit. His only suit, dark wool, brushed clean, looked like a different man, and exactly the same man at once. He stood at the altar and watched Rose come down the aisle toward him with the expression of a man who has been given something he wasn't sure the universe had reserved for him, and when she reached him and took his hand he held it as though he intended to never put it down. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, too low for anyone else to hear. "You look terrified," she said back, equally quiet. "I am," he said, "in the best possible way." The preacher performed the ceremony, and they said the words, and the cold January light lay across the church windows in long pale bars, and the fiddle player from the Harvest Social played something gentle during the signing of the register in Sweetwater Springs, celebrated the thing it had been watching develop. Since October and Martha Delaney's weeping reached a pitch that made her beau gently produce a handkerchief. They went home to his land, their land, that evening. The stone house was warm. The stove had been stoked that morning by a neighbor doing a kindness, and the shelf of books that she had touched with her fingertips 2 months ago now had 3 of her own books on it, moved over from the storeroom she had been living above. It was a small thing, 3 books, but they sat next to his battered copy of David Copperfield, and the sight of them sitting there together was more domestically exact than anything else she could have arranged. They ate a simple supper. They sat by the stove afterward with the windows dark against the January night and the land quiet outside, and they talked about the year ahead, about the cattle, about the store, about the spring planting. They talked about the practical shape of their joined life, and it was the most romantic conversation Rose Norris had ever had, because it was entirely real. He reached over in the middle of a sentence about the east pasture and touched her jaw with the back of his hand very lightly and said, "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up." "You're not," she said. "I know," he said. "I just keep thinking it." She turned her face into his hand. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows. Inside, the stove ticked, and the 3 books in the David Copperfield sat on their shelf in the firelight, and January night settled over 47 acres of Texas land, as though it were settling over a kingdom. Spring came to the Edwards Plateau with the particular urgency of Texas spring. Everything rushed. Colors suddenly violent after the pale winter, the sky a blue so deep it looked thick. Elias was up before dawn every morning, and Rose ran the store 6 days a week. And on Sundays, they worked the land together in a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. She had grown up in a town and had not known much about cattle, but she learned with the same methodical attention she brought to her accounts, and within 3 months she had opinions about the herd that Elias found both amusing and genuinely useful. "The black one is favoring her left foreleg," she told him one Sunday in March, coming in from the pasture with her boots muddy and her sleeves rolled to the elbows. He went and checked, and she was right. He came back in and told her so, and she said, "I thought so," with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with being right and everything to do with having paid the right kind of attention. They added 3 calves that spring. The herd was up to 14, which was not a fortune but was a clear direction. The east pasture was recovering well from its drought years. The well ran clear and reliable through a dry April that made some of the other ranchers in the county nervous. In May, Rose hired a boy named Thomas Kessler, 16 years old, to help with the store on Saturdays, because the store had grown into something that required more than one person on busy days. She had expanded the hardware section and added a small selection of dry goods, and the fact that she was the only source of both in a 20-mile radius meant that her customer base was no longer just Sweetwater Springs but the outlying ranches and farms that sent people to town on a schedule. "You're going to need a bigger building," Elias told her one evening, looking at the plans she had spread across the kitchen table. "I know," she said. "I'm thinking about buying the lot next door." He looked at the plans seriously. "I can help with the construction," he said. "Come summer, the cattle don't need as much. You have your own work," she said. "You're my wife," he said simply. "Your work is mine. Mine is yours. That's how this goes." She looked up from the plans. He was sitting across the table from her in the lamplight with his reading glasses on, a pair he had finally admitted to needing and acquired with some reluctance from the traveling optician who passed through town twice a year, and he was entirely serious and entirely matter-of-fact about it. "That's how this goes," she said. "That's how this goes," he confirmed. She bought the lot in June. Construction began in July. Elias worked on it in the evenings, and on Sundays with the same stubbornness he applied to everything, and he recruited 2 of his neighbors with the promise of fair payment, and they got the frame up in 2 weeks during a stretch of July heat that made every task feel heroic. By September, the expanded Norris feed and supply, which had become, with some negotiation, the Cooper Norris supply, though the sign took another month to get right, was double its original size and stocked accordingly. The night the new sign went up, Elias stood in the street looking at it with his arms folded, and his hat tilted back in that way he had when he was thinking, and Rose came to stand beside him. "Cooper Norris," she said. "Alphabetical order," he said. "That is not why it's in that order," she said. "No," he admitted. The corner of his mouth moved. "I tried every combination. That one sounded right." She leaned into his arm. He unfolded it and put it around her, and they stood in the September street looking at their sign in the early evening light. And she thought about a different September 2 years ago, a woman with a crate, and a man at the counter watching with gray eyes that saw everything. And she felt the particular completeness of a life that has closed its own circles. "I'm happy," she said, not as an announcement, just as a fact being verified. His arm tightened around her. "So am I," he said, "also a fact, also verified." The first shadow over that happiness came in October, almost exactly a year after the harvest social, in the form of a man named Gerald Vane. Gerald Vane was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was something more mundane and therefore more irritating. He was a man with money who was convinced that money was a sufficient argument for anything. He had come to the county in the spring with plans to expand his existing ranch holdings, and he had set his eye on the Cooper land, specifically on the aquifer that fed Elias' reliable well, which sat at the northern edge of the property. And Vane had determined through some geological inquiries, connected to a water source that would be enormously valuable in the increasingly dry climate of West Texas. He came to the house one October afternoon and made an offer. It was a fair offer, more than fair objectively, for 47 acres. Elias thanked him for his time and declined. Vane made a second offer. Elias declined again. Vane made a third offer, this time with a subtle implication that the county land records might turn up some irregularities if he looked hard enough, and at that point Elias put on his hat and held the door. Rose heard about all 3 visits that evening and set down her supper fork with a precision that meant she was very calm about something that was making her not calm at all. "He threatened you," she said. "He implied," Elias said. "Men like that deal in implications. And the land records are clean," he said. "I have every deed, every transfer, every filing. I checked twice when I bought the land and I've checked since. There is nothing to find." "Then we have nothing to worry about," she said. "We have nothing to worry about," he confirmed. "But I want you to know about it." "I want to know about everything," she said. "That's how this goes." He smiled at that. She had given his own words back to him and he recognized it, and the smile was the real one that she could still feel somewhere in her sternum 2 years after it first appeared. They were not entirely without worry, as it turned out, because Gerald Vane was not a man who accepted implications being deflected. In November, he filed a challenge to the water rights attached to the Cooper property with the county land office. Not a challenge that had strong legal legs, but one that required Elias to respond to it with documentation and to engage the county attorney, which cost time and money. Rose closed the store early on the day they went to the county seat. She sat beside Elias in the wagon for the 12-mile drive through November cold, and they did not talk about Vane, but about other things, about a letter she had received from her cousin in Georgia, about the book she was currently reading, about whether the cattle might need supplemental feed through what looked like a hard winter. Ordinary things, the things that a life is actually made of. The county attorney was a methodical man named Hargrove who reviewed the documentation with great thoroughness and arrived at the conclusion that Elias' water rights were clear, documented, and not subject to the challenges filed. He communicated this to Vane's attorney with the polite but final language of a man who has made his determination and is not interested in further argument. Vane did not press further. He was a man with money, not a man with recklessness, and he understood when a position had become untenable. He turned his attention to other properties and other water sources, and the Cooper land was left in peace. On the drive home from the county seat, with the afternoon turning golden and the plains spreading wide on either side of the wagon road, Elias let out a long breath that he seemed to have been holding for the better part of a month. "That's done," he said. "That's done," she agreed. She tucked her hand under his arm. "You weren't actually worried, were you?" "A little," he said. "Not about the records, about—" He paused, looking at the road ahead with those steady eyes. "About whether I could protect what matters to me." "You could," she said. "You did." "We did," he said. He looked at her briefly, directly. "I don't think I've said enough times how much it means to me that you—" He stopped, tried again. "That you're here, that you handle things beside me rather than waiting to see how they come out." "That's how this goes," she said for the third time, and he laughed, a real, full laugh that was still, even 2 years in, one of the sounds she was most grateful for in the world. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a hard one. The snow came in December and stayed past its welcome, and the cattle needed tending in temperatures that tested the character of anyone who had not been born to this land. Elias was out before dawn and back after dark on the worst days, and Rose kept the store going and the house warm and met him at the door with food and the particular quality of attention that is worth more than comfort. There were evenings when he came in so cold and tired that he could barely speak, and she would sit across from him at the kitchen table while he thawed and ate, and they didn't always need to talk on those evenings because there was a kind of communication available to them now that didn't require language. She knew what he needed. He knew what she needed. The grammar of each other had become fluent. One February night, with the wind working at the windows and the stove burning high, she looked up from the book she was reading and said, "I think we should hire a hand." He looked up from the harness he was mending. "I know," he said. "You've been saying you know for 6 months," she said. "Hiring a hand is an expense," he said. "Killing yourself with overwork is also an expense," she said, "only you pay it differently." He looked at the harness, then at her. The reading glasses sat low on his nose, and she had never told him how fond she was of him in the reading glasses, because she knew it would make him self-conscious about them. "I'll ask around in town," he said. "I already have someone in mind," she said. "Johnny Ray's. He's been asking at the store about ranch work. He's young, but he's solid and he knows cattle." "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I have been watching," she said. He smiled at her over the harness. "You always have been," he said. Johnny Ray's was 20 years old, the son of a Mexican family that had been in the county for 2 generations, and he arrived in March with a bedroll and a willingness to work that quickly proved itself genuine. He slept in the barn loft that Elias had lined with boards against the drafts, and he was up before Elias on most mornings, which Elias noted with approval. He was quiet in the way that young men are quiet when they are learning, taking everything in and keeping his own counsel, and he was good with the cattle in the instinctive way that some people are, as though the animals recognized something in him. By spring he was indispensable and everyone knew it, including him, and Elias moved him into a small room at the back of the house that had been used for storage, and paid him a wage that was fair by the standards of the time, which were not generous standards, but it was what the land could support, and Johnny understood that and stayed anyway. The herd grew. By the summer of 1881, they had 23 cattle, and Elias was talking about purchasing the adjacent 20 acres that had come available when its owner died without heirs. He had the money for it, carefully accumulated over 3 years of stubbornness. And Rose had her own opinion about the wisdom of the investment that she offered in the way she always offered her opinions, clearly, without waiting to be asked, and with the relevant numbers already worked out in her head. "It's the right move," she said. "The water rights run to the new parcel as well, and you'll need the grazing room if you're going to push the herd to 30. "You've been thinking about this too," he said. "I think about everything," she said. "It's a habit." He bought the 20 acres. The land was up to 67 acres and the herd was growing and the store was profitable and they were building something real, exactly as he had said he intended to do 2 years ago in December, standing on a porch in the cold with his hat in his hands. In the fall of 1881, Rose told him she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday morning in October, almost exactly 2 years after the harvest social, at the kitchen table over coffee, in the same plain morning light that had illuminated most of the important things between them. She said it simply, because she was a woman who said things simply, and she watched him go very still in the way she had come to understand meant something immense was happening inside him. Then he got up and came around the table and held her for a long moment, not saying anything, and she felt his heart beating fast against her, and she thought, this is what he is when the careful exterior is all the way down. This is what he is underneath all that quiet. Are you frightened? He said, his voice rough and low against her hair. A little, she said honestly. Are you terrified? He said, in the best possible way. She laughed into his shoulder. His arms tightened. The next months unfolded with the particular mixture of the ordinary and the extraordinary that attends a first pregnancy in a household that has learned to take both the ordinary and extraordinary seriously. Rose kept the store running. She had Thomas Kessler full-time by now, graduated from Saturday help to daily employment as the store continued to grow, and she kept the books and managed the ordering and did all the things she had always done, because there was no reason not to, and because sitting still was not a quality she possessed. Elias built a cradle. He built it in the evenings over 2 months, in the workshop that had once been a storage room, with the same attention he gave to everything structural, measuring and remeasuring, and getting the joints exactly right and finishing the wood with a smoothness that was beyond strictly necessary. He brought it into the bedroom one evening and set it beside the bed and stood back and looked at it with his arms folded. It's beautiful, Rose said. It's level, he said, with the satisfaction of a man who has achieved what he was aiming for. That too, she said. Elias, it's beautiful. He looked at it for another moment, then at her. I keep thinking about what to say to a child, he said quietly. What I would want someone to have said to me, what I missed. She knew something about his childhood, not everything, but enough to understand that it had been harder than it should have been, that there were absences in it, that the self-sufficiency he wore so naturally had been built over something early and essential that had been taken away too soon. You'll know what to say, she said. You always know. You just take your time getting there. He looked at her. The reading glasses were on the table. The cradle stood in the lamplight, level and smooth and made with intention. With you beside me, he said, I think I probably will. Their son was born on a March morning in 1882, just as the first real warmth was returning to the plateau, and the cattle were beginning to move with the easy energy of animals that have survived a winter and know it. Rose labored through a night that was long but not catastrophic, attended by Mrs. Drummond, who had delivered half the children in the county, and Elias sat in the kitchen with Johnny Rays across from him, neither of them saying much, just drinking coffee and existing through the hours in the companionable solidarity of men who have been assigned the waiting and understand its necessity. When Mrs. Drummond came to the kitchen door and told him he had a son and that both were well, Elias set his coffee cup down on the table with a hand that was not entirely steady. He held the baby with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that he is holding something that has no margin for error, and the baby, red-faced and new and entirely himself, looked up at his father with the unfocused gaze of a human being who has just arrived and is taking stock of things. Thomas, Elias said. Looking at Rose, checking, they had discussed the name. Thomas Harold, Rose confirmed. Thomas for the boy at the store who had been faithful and good. Harold for her father, who had built the store and left it to her and trusted her to know what to do with it. Thomas Harold Cooper, Elias said, and his voice was so quiet that only Rose, lying in the bed with the morning light coming through the window, could hear the whole of what was in it. The town was genuinely pleased. Martha Delaney arrived within the day with enough food to last a week. Mayor Aldrich sent congratulations by way of his wife. Thomas Kessler, 18 now and as reliable as anyone Rose had ever employed, kept the store running with complete competence through the days she was home recovering, and came by in the evenings to report on the day's business with a thoroughness that made her proud. Johnny Reyes worked the ranch with the quiet dedication that had become his signature, expanding the morning and evening routines to account for Elias' need to be in the house more than usual in those first weeks. And he did it without being asked and without comment, because that was the kind of person he was. Sweetwater Springs had a particular warmth for a family that had earned its place in the town's story, and the Cooper family had done that slowly, stubbornly, by showing up and paying their debts and building things well and treating people honestly. The town knew this family now in the deep way that small towns know the people who have become part of their structure, and it held them accordingly. Thomas Harold Cooper was a remarkable baby, but then all babies are remarkable if you are paying the right kind of attention. He had Elias' gray eyes and Rose's dark hair, and he grew with the determination of a plant that has found good soil. By summer, he was smiling. By fall, he had opinions about everything, expressed loudly and often, which was a quality Rose recognized as her own contribution, and Elias acknowledged with a straight face that he found entirely amusing. They settled into the life of a family with a child adjusting the rhythms, redistributing the weight, finding new capacities in each other. Elias, who had worried about knowing what to say, discovered that he knew exactly what to do. He was steady and present and attentive in the way that mattered most to a child, which is the same way it matters to adults. You show up. You are reliable. You give them room to be themselves. Rose watched him with their son in the evenings and felt something that she did not have adequate language for, which was new for her. She was a woman of precise language, but what she felt watching Elias Cooper with his child, the care and the joy and the quiet competence of a man who had decided that fatherhood was a thing worth doing correctly, was somewhere past the reach of words. She told him this one evening, sitting on the porch of the stone house with the summer dark coming down and the sound of Thomas asleep inside. "I don't have words for it," she said. He looked at her sideways. "That must be uncomfortable," he said very gently. "It is," she said. "I'm managing." He reached over and took her hand in the way he had done since December of 1879, standing on a porch in the cold, and it still felt the same warm and calloused and certain. "I have words for it," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Yes," he said. "It's everything, that's the word. It's everything." She looked out at the dark plain with its river of stars overhead, and she thought about a woman in a green dress crossing a room, and about a man by a wall who hadn't been sure he should have come, and about 2 years of Thursdays and coffee in a back room, and a December porch and a January church, and the particular gravity that some things have, as though they were always going to happen and were only waiting for you to arrive. "It is," she said. "It's everything." The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because a life without difficulty is a story without honesty, and both Rose and Elias had been committed to honesty from the first Thursday in November over cooling coffee. There were droughts, and there were years when the cattle market was bad, and there were the 1,000 small negotiations of two people who are both competent and both opinionated, sharing a life and a land and a business. There were nights when the conversation ran hard before it ran warm again, and mornings after those nights that required the particular courage of people who have decided that the repair is worth more than the rupture. But the difficulties were always navigable, because they had built their foundation not on assumptions or performances, but on the real material of who they actually were, and real material holds. In the spring of 1884, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara, who came into the world with a velocity that suggested she had been waiting for the right moment and had decided the moment was now. Clara had Rose's dark eyes and her own entirely particular quality of determination, and she learned to walk at 9 months and never really stopped moving after that. Thomas, who was 2.5 when Clara arrived, received his sister with the benign suspicion of an older child who is not entirely certain this development serves his interests, but is willing to gather more data. Within 3 months, he was her most devoted defender, a role he would maintain with a consistency that made both his parents quietly proud. The store had continued to grow. By 1884, the Cooper Norris supply was the largest dry goods and hardware operation between two county seats, and Rose had hired 3 employees full-time. She had also, in the preceding year, formalized an arrangement with 2 neighboring towns to serve as their primary supplier, which meant a delivery wagon went out twice a week, and the order books were fuller than they had ever been. Elias' land was up to 90 acres. The herd was 40, which was real prosperity by the standards of the county, and he had a reputation among the ranching community for cattle management that brought people to him for advice and occasional partnership. He was not a silent presence at the edges of things anymore. He was still quiet, still deliberate, still the kind of man who chose his words rather than spending them freely, but he was present in the way that people are present when they have found the life that fits them. Johnny Reyes had built himself a small house on the northern edge of the property and had courted and married a woman named Esperanza from a family 2 counties over, and they were raising their own family on the Cooper land with a permanence that had the feel of roots. This had been a deliberate choice on Elias' part, to give Johnny Reyes not just employment but a stake in the place, which was a kind of acknowledgement of what his work had meant and meant still. "He deserves it," Elias had said simply when Rose had raised the arrangement that evening. "He built this place as much as I did." She had looked at him across the table. "You know," she said, "for a man who once stood at the edge of a room trying not to be noticed, you turned out to be a remarkable human being." "You noticed me," he said. "I did," she said. "Then I had something to work toward," he said. They were 37 and 30 years old respectively in 1885. Which felt different from how Rose had imagined 30 and 37 feeling when she was younger. It felt more established, more certain, more capable. They had the look of people who had built what they meant to build and were now living in it, not finished, never finished, because there was always another acre to tend and another delivery to plan and another season to prepare for, but settled in the sense that matters most, which is the knowledge of where you are and who you are with. The Harvest Social of 1885 fell on the last Saturday of October, which was 6 years, almost to the week, from the Harvest Social of 1879. It was held in the same Grange Hall, now a little larger thanks to a community improvement project from the previous year, and decorated with the same combination of cornstalks and paper flowers and lanterns, and the same fiddle player was there, older but still accurate. Rose put on the green dress. It fit differently than it had 6 years ago. She had a different body now, the body of a woman who had worked and given birth and worked some more, but the color was still right and the tortoiseshell comb was still in her hair. Elias put on the suit. The dark wool was brushed clean, as it always was when the suit came out, and it fit him the way clothes fit a man who has grown more fully into himself over years, rather than changing shape arbitrarily. They arrived together at the Grange Hall with Thomas, 6 years old and wearing a version of his father's seriousness in a smaller face, and Clara, 3 years old and wearing no seriousness whatsoever, full of opinions about the lanterns and the music and the number of cookies available at the refreshment table. The hall was full of the same 400 souls, or their successors and additions, and the same fiddle reel, and the same cider. The same social gravity that sorted people into participants and watchers operated in the same way it always had, though the specific positions had changed. Elias Cooper was not standing by the east wall. He was standing near the center of the room with Thomas at his side, and Clara pulling at his hand toward the cookies, and he was talking with 2 of the neighboring ranchers about the coming winter and the price of beef. And he was easy in it, not relaxed exactly, because he was still a man who did not wear rooms lightly, but present in a way that the East Wall version of him had not been. Rose watched him from the door where she was talking with Martha, who was now Martha Hennessy and had 3 children of her own and had not entirely lost the habit of providing commentary. 6 years, Martha said, following her gaze. 6 years, Rose confirmed. You walked across this room, Martha said, and I thought you had lost your mind. You thought no such thing, Rose said. You had been telling me to talk to him for weeks. I had been saying you were staring at him for weeks, Martha corrected. I had said nothing about acting on it. The acting on it was all you, Rose smiled. The fiddle shifted to a waltz. Clara successfully acquired a cookie and was now reporting this achievement to her father at top volume. The best decision I ever made, Rose said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was an accounting. A balance sheet, tallied and found correct. Across the room, Elias looked up. Their eyes found each other across the hall with the ease of 2 years of Thursdays and 5.5 years of marriage, and the particular intimacy of people who have learned each other at the level of grammar rather than vocabulary. He said something to Clara, who ran toward her mother with the cookie held triumphantly aloft, and he came across the room, not the way he had approached rooms before. Not the East Wall version. He came directly, with his hat still on and the familiar line of his jaw and the gray eyes that the lantern light was currently calling something close to blue. He came and stood beside her, where he had been standing for 6 years beside her, not behind her, not in front but beside. "Dance," he said. She looked at him with the same dark attention she had turned on him across this room 6 years ago, and she saw the same man she had seen then, the careful frayed cuffs, the polished cracked boots, the immense quiet competence of a man who had decided that showing up was worth the effort, and she saw also what the years had added. The ease of a man who has arrived, the sureness of a man who is known and knowing. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. They moved to the center of the floor among the other couples, among the 400 souls of Sweetwater Springs in the October lantern light, and the fiddle played something slow and sweet, and the October air came through the cracked window, the same window, still cracked, East Wall, still there though they were not, and Elias Cooper danced with his wife with the grace of a man who has been practicing for 6 years. "Do you remember," she said quietly as they moved, "what you said to me the first night? When I told you I'd been watching you all evening." "I asked why," he said. "You did," she said. "And I said because you looked like the most interesting person in the room." "And I've been trying to be worth that answer ever since," he said. She looked up at him. "You have been worth it every day," she said. He held her a little closer. "So have you," he said. The fiddle played. The hall turned around them. Clara was somewhere near the refreshment table negotiating a second cookie with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had her mother's way with numbers. Thomas was beside Johnny Ray's oldest boy at the edge of the dance floor, watching the dancers with an expression of deep assessment that was entirely his father's. Sweetwater Springs celebrated its harvest the way it had celebrated 6 years of harvests before, and 10 years before that, and as it would continue to celebrate for years to come with music and cider, and the noise of 400 lives that were, in their accumulated ordinariness, extraordinary. And in the center of it, Rose and Elias Cooper danced, and the room that had once been a room nobody looked at him in was now a room in which they were fully, entirely, irreducibly present together, in the lamplight, in the October of their lives. The decade that followed was the fullness of everything they had planted. The Cooper Ranch grew to 120 acres by 1889, and the herd numbered 62, which was enough to place Elias among the established ranching names of the county. Not the biggest, never the biggest, but solid and respected and built to last. He had earned that reputation the way he earned everything, by being exact and honest, and by doing what he said he would do on the schedule he said he would do it. The Cooper Norris supply occupied its expanded space, and then some, and by 1890 Rose had negotiated a freight arrangement with the new rail line that connected the county to larger markets, and made the store's supply chain both cheaper and more reliable. She understood the railroad in the way she understood everything, as a system with inputs and outputs and particular pressure points where knowledge and leverage could be usefully applied. And she had applied that understanding to build something that was now genuinely a business of consequence in the region. Thomas Harold Cooper grew up with the thoughtfulness of his father and the directness of his mother and a particular quality of his own that neither of them could entirely account for, which was a gift for the kind of conversation that made people feel heard in the deepest way. At 10 years old, he was the person every younger child in the house sought out when they were upset about something, and he listened to them with an attention that was not performed but real, and he found, always, the thing to say. Clara Cooper grew up with both her parents' best qualities dialed up to their highest expression, and none of their patience, which made her magnificent and exhausting in equal measure. And by the time she was 6, she was running the arithmetic on the store's daily receipts as a game and getting them right, and Rose had begun to wonder whether she was raising her own eventual successor. In 1891, a second daughter arrived, named Alice, who was quieter than Clara but sharper in the particular way that quiet people are often sharp, storing observations for use at the precise right moment. Elias held her in the hospital room. They had a proper doctor now, and a room that was almost adequate, and the standard of childbirth in the county had improved from Rose's first experience, and looked at her with the same expression he had worn at Thomas's birth, the one that was beyond being composed. "Another one who'll tell me what she thinks," he said. "That's the Cooper family tradition," Rose said from the bed, tired and happy. "Honest people who take their time but say what they mean. I seem to have married a Norris," he said, "who says what she means immediately and does not take her time," she finished. "I know. The children are getting the best of both. It's working out very well." He sat beside her bed with Alice in his arms and Thomas and Clara somewhere in the outer room being supervised by Martha Hennessy, who had driven out the moment she heard, and the afternoon light was the particular gold of a Texas October, which was the season that everything important seemed to happen to them. "Rose," he said. "Elias," she said. "Thank you," he said, just that. As if the words were carrying a weight that required them to be short. "For what specifically?" she said. "For crossing the room," he said. She looked at him, at this man she had been watching for 12 years across different distances and in different lights, and who she had never once gotten tired of looking at. "It was the easiest thing I ever did," she said. He smiled. "The real one. The one that transformed his face. The one she had been storing somewhere she now had a name for. She was storing it in the part of herself that she would take with her out of this world, the part that held the things that made the life worth the living. It didn't look easy," he said. "The things that matter never do," she said. "They look exactly as hard as they are. The easy part is deciding they're worth it." He shifted Alice carefully in his arms, that patient, deliberate care, and reached across and took Rose's hand, and she felt it the way she had felt it every time in 12 years of occasions, warm and calloused and certain. Outside the window of the room, October was doing its work on the Edwards Plateau, turning the land to amber and rust and pale gold, and the sky was the deep clear blue of autumn. And somewhere south of town, 62 cattle grazed on 120 acres of land that had been built from 47 unreliable ones through 2 years and 5 years and 12 years of stubbornness and care. And in the room, with the gold light and the new child in the held hand, Elias Cooper and Rose Norris Cooper existed in the life they had made from an October evening and a green dress and a decision to cross the room. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. 3 years later, in 1894, on the occasion of their 13th wedding anniversary, Elias gave Rose a letter. He had never given her a letter before. He was, as she had always known, a man of carefully chosen spoken words rather than written ones, and he set it on the breakfast table beside her coffee cup with the expression of a man who has done something that cost him something and knows it but is not going to take it back. She read it at the table with him sitting across from her, watching her read it with a steadiness that she knew concealed a vulnerability she was not going to exploit. The letter said, "Rose, I have been thinking about the kind of accounting a life requires. Not the numbers kind, which you have always done better than me, but the other kind. The kind where you lay out what you have been given and try to understand the full measure of it. When I came to Sweetwater Springs in 1877, I was a man who had decided, with some evidence in support of the decision, that the kind of life involving other people was not a life available to him. I had 47 acres and 11 cattle and a book someone left behind, and I thought that was the appropriate scale for what I was. I want you to know that you did not just change that conclusion. You made me understand that the conclusion had been wrong from the start, that I had been available for that life all along and had simply not yet encountered the person who could see it. You saw it from across a room in 1879 and you walked toward it, and I have been walking with you ever since, and I intend to walk with you for every year remaining to me. 13 years, everything. I love you, Rose, Elias." She set the letter down. She was not going to cry at the breakfast table. She had never cried at the breakfast table, and she was not going to establish the habit now. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said, the careful stillness of a man waiting for a verdict. "This is the most," she stopped. "I don't have words again." "That seems to keep happening," he said with the quietest version of his smile. "Only with you," she said. "You are the only thing in my life that consistently defeats my vocabulary." "I'll put it on my headstone," he said. "You will not," she said. "You will put something practical on your headstone, like your name and the dates and whether the acreage turned out." He laughed, full and warm and honest. The laugh she had been collecting since the harvest social of 1879, adding to the store of it, finding it always sufficient and always something to look forward to. She got up and went around the table and put her arms around him from behind, and he covered her arms with his hands, and they sat like that for a while in the morning kitchen with the coffee cooling and the children's voices starting up somewhere in the house, and the October light coming through the windows of the stone house that had once been plain and was now full of years of their making, full of books and children's drawings, and the ledgers of a profitable store and tools laid out in careful order, and the cradle that was now in the attic because it had served its purpose 3 times and might yet serve it again. Everything was real. Everything had been built. Everything was exactly as he had said it would be, something worth everything she had brought to it. The last detail of the accounting belonged to a morning some years later. Thomas was 14 and studying with the schoolteacher in town, with an intent that suggested he would go further with his education than Sweetwater Springs could provide. And Clara was 11 and had already reorganized the store's inventory system with improvements that Thomas Kessler, now 29 and the store's full manager, had adopted with complete pragmatism. Alice was 9 and reading everything she could find and asking questions nobody had prepared adequate answers for. On that morning, Elias came in from the east pasture at midday and found Rose in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the accounting ledgers and the particular expression she wore when the numbers were working the way she wanted them to. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her, and she looked up and said, "The railroad contract renewed. Better terms." "I knew it would," he said. "You did not know it would," she said. "You hoped it would. There's a difference." "I knew you would make it," he said. "Same thing." She looked at him across the kitchen table, across 15 years of kitchen tables, of coffee and ledgers and honest conversations and the grammar of each other as fluent as breathing, and she thought, this is it. This is the whole thing. This is what I crossed a room for. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would do it again," she said. "Every part of it. I would stand in a doorway in a green dress, and I would look across the room, and I would see you by the east wall trying to be furniture, and I would walk over there, and I would say I have been watching you all evening, and it would be the best and truest thing I had ever done." He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her with those gray eyes in the afternoon light and he said, "And I would still be standing there, waiting, because I think some part of me always knew that the only thing that could get me off that wall was someone who looked at me and saw something worth crossing the room for." "There was everything worth crossing the room for," she said. "Yes," he said, simply and completely. "There was." Outside the kitchen window, the land that had once been 47 acres and was now considerably more stretched south and east under the wide Texas sky. And the cattle moved in the slow, purposeful way of cattle that are well tended. And Johnny Rays and his oldest son were mending the north fence with the particular efficiency of people who know their work. And somewhere in the house a child was reading, and another child was counting, and another child was asking a question that deserved a real answer. And in the kitchen, over coffee and ledgers and the honest morning light of a life that had been built the right way, carefully, truthfully, with full attention to what actually mattered, Rose Norris Cooper and Elias Cooper existed in the fullness of the thing they had made from a single decision on an October night when a woman in a green dress had looked across a crowded room and thought, "That man is the most interesting person here, and nobody is talking to him, and that is a waste I am not willing to allow." She had been right, she had always been right, and he had been worth every step of the crossing.